Hey, welcome back. This is Mr. Shanahan for Magnet Sociology. This is Chapter 18, Social Change and Modernization. We're going to talk in Section 1 about the social change and theories of social change. And then Section 2, we're going to talk about modernization. Section 1, Social Change. The major factors that stimulate social change are values and beliefs, technology, diffusion, population, the physical environment, and wars and conquests. Then we're going to talk about ethnocentrism, cultural lag, vested interests, and all create resistance to social change. Our main idea is the major factors that stimulate social change are values and beliefs, technology, diffusion of population, the physical environment, and wars and conquests. Ethnocentrism, cultural lag, and vested interests all create resistance to social change. So when you finish this section, you should be able to answer what are the main sources of social change and why is there resistance to social change? So our ideology, our values and beliefs, a system of beliefs or ideas that justifies the social, moral, religious, political, and economic interests held by a group or by society. It often spreads through social movements and can have far-reaching effects. Technology, the knowledge and tools that people use to adjust and adapt to their environment, and it arises through discovery and invention. Diffusion, sharing the spread cultural traits from one society to another. Reformulation, the process of adapting and borrowed cultural traits. And we see this quite a bit in the United States. The United States is famous for its diffusion, the adopting of other cultural ideas. Population is a change in size. The composition of a population can cause changes in the culture. In size can affect the economy. Different cultures brought together through migration all can affect that. And then finally, physical environment, origin of food supplies, natural disasters, changes in supply of demand, natural resources can change the culture and the groups that are affected. Wars and conquests are not as common as the other sources, but are more dramatic changes, and war often results in technological and medical advances that cause massive social change. The impact of the automobile was a major effect of social cultural change. The invention of the automobile did more than furnish Americans with a new form of transportation. Over time, it also brought huge changes to the American social life. To begin with, the automobile changed the country's human geography by making living in the suburbs much easier. Cars changed architecture too, with houses with attached garages and becoming the standard in home construction. In addition, cars affected the way people shopped, making huge suburban shopping malls and drive-through restaurants and banks all became possible. Finally, the automobile helped to create several new service industries such as the car repair, gas stations, and roadside motels. Also, the automobile had a major effect on dating behavior. What are 6 major factors that cause social change? Values and beliefs. The changing in values and beliefs create a significant social change. Technology can change a great deal of social change and values. Diffusion of population with the introduction of multiple cultures or the changing of populations can affect that. The physical environment can change, and of course, wars and conquests. Resistance rarely occurs without opposition. Social change rarely occurs without opposition. Many who oppose the change come to accept it. Some remain opposed but learn to adapt. Ethnocentrism, people often believe that their own ideas and the ways of doing things are the best and strongly resist changes from outside their culture. We see this a great deal in the concept of when we talk about political correctness. Some people don't understand why it's not right to call people by racist names or use racial stereotypes. And it's because of, we developed that. Cultural lag. Material culture changes quickly while non-material culture lags behind and changes more slowly. Oftentimes they refer to changes in society often happen much sooner than, like, say, they happen in the church. The church is typically much further behind the attitude of the people when it comes to social change. New laws and customs must be formed to address new technology. Vested interests. People who benefit from the status quo usually resist change. Some people feel that the known problems of today are better than the unknown problems that come with change. And this is oftentimes why older people frequently are very conservative minded, because they have established how things are going to be. They live that way. And so now they don't want things to change on them. What forms does resistance to social change take? Ethnocentrism, the idea that beliefs of one's own society are superior to the beliefs of other cultures and societies. And we see this with the idea that the American way is the best way. Other countries don't know how to do things right. Cultural lag is the fact that material cultures change faster than non-material cultures. So here in the West, it's easier for the countries like the United States or in Europe. They have this vested interest in material goods, and it's easier for them to adapt to new attitudes and culture as a result than a more pre-industrialized society. Vested interests, oftentimes older people or the established groups have a harder time giving up control, and they resist change in that way. That's why both the Democrats and the Republicans make it so hard for a third party to rise up, because of the fact that they have a vested interest in maintaining the power. The fact that many in the society prefer social change to occur, I should say. All right, globalization and social change. One of the most powerful forces influencing life today is globalization, the process by which societies around the world become increasingly interconnected and interdependent. Social change comes quickly when the more societies have the ability to interact and trade with each other. China for many years tried to keep the rest of the world out, and then finally in the 1970s, when Nixon finally went to China in the early 1970s and late 1960s, Nixon went to China and opened them up, and it still took a good 20 years or so for them to really start to trade openly with the West. And once they started, though, things really took off. Economic globalization, where multinational corporations operate offices in many different countries, and as a result have to develop many different cultural aspects to their company structure. This helps them sell products and become more influential worldwide. Globalization of transportation, as we saw in the recent pandemic that happened in 2020, globalization allows for people to move across the world, and in doing those, they exchange both good and bad things, and as a result, this has a dramatic effect on society. New forms of transportation, like the airplane, has emerged, and other ways of communication that have, like television, telephone, and all that kind of thing, radio, have made it much easier for us to communicate across borders. Globalization and social change, one of the most powerful forces influencing life today is globalization, the process by which societies around the world become increasingly interconnected and interdependent. Tourism, as transportation routes improve, tourism becomes more common and less expensive. Face-to-face interactions among a variety of people can occur. Tourism allows people who may not otherwise deal with those particular types of people, gives them the opportunity to travel to other parts of the world or the country and see things that they might not have otherwise experienced or become aware of. Diversity in America. Globalization has led to the American people to be much more diverse. America typically has had a relatively open immigration policy, which has allowed people from all over the world to immigrate to the United States and be absorbed into our culture, and people bring their foods, clothing, and religions and things like that to the American society, which oftentimes expands out from there and becomes absorbed into the American culture as well. So how does globalization contribute to social change, and how has globalization affected your community? What changes has globalization brought to your life? Now let's talk about theories of social change. The functionalist perspective offers three explanations of social change. There's the cyclical theory, which suggests that societies arise and go through various stages of development. Then they decline. Evolutionary theory then holds that societies develop toward increasing complexity. The equilibrium theory holds that the change occurs in an effort to maintain social stability. And from conflict perspective, change is the result of conflict inherent in society. So our main idea for this portion of the section is sociologists have developed theories to describe how and why social change occurs. The functionalist theory suggests that change takes place to maintain balance and order. Remember, the functionalist theory is always about what is the function of this particular aspect of society. And conflict theory focuses on the conflict among groups as a source of change. Conflict theory will always look at the things that cause change to take place within the society, and that's how you explain social change. So at the end of this portion, you should be able to explain what functionalist theories have been offered to explain social change, and how do the conflict theories explain the social change. Well, first we're going to talk, the first functionalist theory we're going to talk about is cyclical theory. In cyclical theory, societies arise and develop in stages and then decline. So Oswald Spengler, societies pass through 4 stages, represented as the human life stages. Piltram Sorkins describes it as societies swing between extremes of faith and science. And then we have the principle of imminent change, where the natural tendency towards change is suggested by Sorkin. Okay, so that evolutionary theory is another functionalist theory that societies change only toward increasing complexity. So just like animals evolve to best fit their environment, societies also evolve to best fit their environment. The additive process is each adaptation in society is the basis for future adaptations. Social change come from many sources and take many paths. Equilibrium theory is a change in one part of the social system produces changes in all other parts of the social system. So you see that like when African Americans gained the right to vote. You saw all sorts of changes where they started to change discrimination policies and things like that. Even it was slow, but eventually changes took place. So how does cyclical and evolutionary theory and equilibrium theory explain social change? Cyclical theory, societies rise and grow through various stages of development, and then they fall. Evolutionary theory is society moves towards increasing complexity. Equilibrium theory, a change in one part of the social system produces change in all other parts of the social system. So this is oftentimes how we define change. Conflict theory, on the other hand, according to conflict theorists, change results from conflicts between groups with opposing interests. Most conflicts arise from disputes over access to power and wealth. Karl Marx, of course, he's our great conflict theorist. Karl Marx defined it through class conflict. Class conflict, all societies throughout history have been subject to conflicts between the people who have power and those who lack power. Social change arises from the powerless seeking power, and violent revolution would result in a classless society. According to conflict theorists, change results from conflicts between groups with opposing interests. Most conflicts arise from disputes over access to power and wealth. Darndorf's social conflict theory agrees with Marx that conflict is a central feature of all societies. Darndorf claims that social conflict can take many forms. Violent revolution is not always necessary for social conflict to take place. Modern critics claim social scope of conflict theories is far too limited to explain the complexity of social change. So Marx's theory of social change, Karl Marx saw social change as a result of conflict between the classes. His thesis, society becomes increasingly divided into two classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The antithesis of this thesis was eventually the proletariat becomes angry with the situation and revolts against the bourgeoisie. And the synthesis is the new power arrangement in which the proletariat takes control and is established as the new power elite. And in this process, the thesis antithesis synthesis repeats over time until finally we end up with a classless society. The functionalist perspective was cyclical theory, suggests that societies rise and go through various stages of development and then they decline. Evolutionary theory holds that societies develop toward increasing complexity. Equilibrium theory suggests that change occurs in an effort to maintain social stability. And then finally, conflict perspective, once again, social change results from conflict among groups in society. Since conflict is a natural condition for all societies, social change is inevitable. So how did Darndorf and Marx's views conflict? Marx believed that social change occurs when the powerless attempt to gain power, while Darndorf believed that social change could be accomplished through compromise. Section 2, modernization is the process by which a society's social institutions become more complex. Sociologists offer two explanations for this process: modernization theory and the world system theory. Our main idea is modernization is the process by which society's social institutions become more complex. Sociologists offer two explanations of this process: modernization theory and world system theory. So by the end of this, you should be able to understand how do sociologists explain the process of modernization and what impact has modernization had on social life and the natural environment. Modernization is the process by which society's social institutions become increasingly complex as society moves towards industrialization and beyond. Of the two groups of countries, more developed and less developed, the more developed nations have modernized more rapidly. Modernization theory is that more developed nations modernized because they were the first to industrialize. Other nations will modernize as they industrialize. To speed the process, many industrialized nations established assistance programs which had little effect because of this failure. Some have abandoned the theory of modernization. Population and resources differ in more or less developed nations. Also, part of the problem with the industrialization of less industrialized countries is that either they lack the resources to sustain modernization, or the modernization was done in order to support the industrialized nations that were bringing those ideas there. There are three types of nations: the core nations, peripheral nations, and semi-peripheral nations. Core nations are the most powerful developed nations that control most of the world's resources and have diversified economies with strong manufacturing and service sectors, such as the United States, Great Britain, France, China. Peripheral nations control few productive resources and depend on core nations for financial aid, technology, manufactured goods, and they also provide much of the raw material to core nations. You'll see many of these peripheral nations in places like Africa, in Central America. Semi-peripheral nations are somewhere in between core and peripheral nations. So these would be those countries that are still kind of dependent, but are rising up. Some argue that peripheral nations gain from economic interactions. Others feel peripheral nations actually gain little from these interactions. Peripheral nations put their entire focus on the needs of the core nations, so that there is little diversification. Money becomes concentrated with the few who rule the peripheral nations. This theory does not account for reasons behind the core nations' growth. So, characteristics of modernized and non-modernized societies. I'll let you study this chart for a moment. Modernization can bring congestion, air pollution, as this photograph of Cairo, Egypt shows. So what benefit do you think modernization has brought to the residents of Cairo? Statistically speaking, the world system theorists use several political, social, economic measures to establish where nations are located on the development continuum. One often used economic measure is gross domestic product, the value of finished goods and services produced in a country in a given period. The bar graph to the right shows the GDP for several core, semi-peripheral, and peripheral nations. How do GDPs among core and semi-peripheral and peripheral nations compare? How do modernization theory and world system theory differ in the way they look at modernization? Modernization theory suggests that more developed nations modernize because of industrialization, while world system theory views modernization in the terms of a world economy. The impact of modernization. The positive consequences is the increase of a standard of living. Longer life expectancy, lower birth rates, higher rates of literacy, a decrease in economic and social inequality, and more personal comforts. It also improves the infrastructure. The system of roads, ports, and other facilities are all necessary for a modern economy, and so these things all become well developed. It typically brings electricity, telephones, computers, and universities to these places. The negative consequences of modernization, however, are family and religion often lose much of their authority. The government takes a larger role in a person's life. Social relationships are likely to be weaker. And new technology brings new moral and ethical questions. It often harms the environment. So what are some of the positive and negative consequences of modernization? Positive, it increased standard of living, decreased economic and social inequality. Negative, it's increased social problems, the rise of moral and ethical questions, and the destruction of the environment. So that concludes chapter 18 and then completes our study of sociology. Feel free to review this and all the other audios, and this will all come in useful for your exam in the near future. Thank you for joining us this year.